Good evening. My name is Gigi Wolf, and I am the Senior Economic Education Specialist for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. I am one of over 50 subject matter experts throughout the Federal Reserve System who serve as an education outreach arm of the Fed. Our group, representing audiences within our various districts, provides professional development for pre-kindergarten through college level educators, offers economic literacy programs for K through 16 students, partners with like-minded organizations to promote financial capability, and develops classroom-ready resources to support instruction in economics, personal finance, college and career readiness, and related courses. Our collective efforts are aimed at increasing educators' ability to teach economics and personal finance while helping students and the public gain real-life skills to increase their economic literacy and financial acumen. My colleagues and I are pleased you can join us for this important discussion on issues that are currently spanning the globe. The topic of racial inequity has surfaced internationally, causing many of us to think about the constructs of race very differently and more broadly. At times, it seems that the racial divide has become even more pronounced, stemming from tragic real-life events combined with a universal health crisis. During tonight's program, we'll examine how these issues relate to economics and more specifically, economics instruction. Through a brief keynote presentation, panel discussion, and open forum for your questions, we'll explore how our economy has shifted, resulting from racial inequity and inequality. We'll also touch on economic factors that affect minority populations, offering real-world material for your economics classrooms. We brought national experts together to address these issues, and you'll have an opportunity to interact with them shortly. So prepare those questions. Before we begin our exploration on this topic, let me first share our disclaimer that the views and perspectives of the presenters are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve System, its governors, officers, or representatives. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's keynote speaker. Dr. Gary Hoover, also known as Hoov, is currently a President's Associates Presidential Professor and the chair of the Economics Department at the University of Oklahoma. He received his PhD in economics from Washington University in St. Louis in 1998. And since then, he has published numerous research papers, book chapters, and reviews on the public policy of income redistribution, poverty, political economy, and ethics within the profession. Dr. Hoover is the co-chair of the American Economic Association Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the economics profession and is the vice president of the Southern Economic Association. He is the founding and current editor of the Journal of Economics, Race and Policy, and has been a visiting scholar at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin. Additionally, Dr. Hoover is a network member of Center for Economic Studies and IFO Institute in Munich, Germany, and has been a guest professor at the Universities of Hanover and Constance in Germany, the University of Vienna in Austria, and Chiang-Cheng-Tao University in China. His remarks will be immediately followed by a moderated Q&A led by Mary Suter, Assistant Vice President and Economic Education Officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Hoov, the floor is now yours.
I want to thank everybody for coming in tonight. I do realize that Zoom fatigue is real. I suffer from it myself. And so for those of you who have taken the time to sign in tonight, can't thank you enough, especially on a topic like this. So what I thought that I would do with this time is basically try and share information with you, information that I picked up from my time as the co-chair of the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the econ profession, and from having taught economics and have included race into that discussion in most of my classes, and particularly in my introductory principles explorations of economics, because I realized that for many of our students, this is going to be their only exposure to economics, right? They're going to take those mandatory courses as freshmen, and then that's going to be it. And so it is incumbent upon us that at a time like this, we show them that we are broad-based and that there is a certain amount of appeal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be jumping back and forth from you just looking at me to some materials that I have lined up to share with you. And so I'll be sharing my screen a bit with you. I think then at that point, the moderators have some mechanism in place to accept questions for your comments that will come up during the later portion. So one of the things I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you this to start with. And one of the things that comes up often that people are concerned about is they say, look, how do I have a chapter on race, ethnicity, inclusion, diversity? And my answer is there isn't any real need in economics instruction to have that sitting out to itself on the side. The curriculum naturally has several areas in which we can see race and ethnicity fitting in without it being forced at all. And so that's the first thing I think the question that comes up the most is, how do I introduce this topic? And my answer is, you introduce it naturally as you would any other portion or any other part of the curriculum that fits. The second thing that'll come up is, the second point I have here is about confidence and in the subject matter. And I think that what you have to have there is a willingness to be informed on these topics. To some extent, they could be controversial, but they don't necessarily have to be. There is a natural way that these ideas and topics fit into our curriculum. And finally and foremost, I think one of the things we have to be willing to do as instructors is to simply listen, right? And I can share part of my story is that as a young man, I grew up with my mother being the hardest working person that I knew, but still she would continue to say to us that, hey, you know what? Working hard will get you ahead. Working hard is the most important thing that matters. And I never saw a person that worked harder than she did. Terribly hardworking person. But we never seem to have gotten ahead, right? We always seem to have been struggling. Our economic circumstances never seem to have improved. That then led me to questions about, I wonder what else is going on here in this story that is potentially missing. When I came to economics, it was economics that I used to try and answer those questions. Could I answer the questions of, are there other aspects to working hard and to our economy that might have been missed? And I found that economics has, to a great extent, given me many, many answers to those types of questions. So let me share a different screen with you now, and I'll just keep going back and forth with this. talking and sharing some information. Now you should be seeing the page of one of the many pages on the American Economics Association website. So if you were to type in American Economics Association, you can find this page here. One of the great things about this page is that it has a page dedicated to best practices for economists in building a more diverse, inclusive, and productive profession. And as I go along here, there are going to be research articles that you can have access to. There's also different categories. A lot of this stuff is going to more so be geared towards college level instruction, but not all of it, right? Because working with students, as you see here, is something that is all of us as instructors will have the opportunity to do. And so I would encourage you all that if you could make your way to our AEA Best Practices format. And in addition to that, to the extent that you have information to share, I would encourage you to bring that to our attention so that we can constantly keep updating that page. The other thing that I think we ought to be aware of, and I'm going to take you back to that page. Like I said, I'm just going to keep jumping back and forth between sharing information. What I found is that when I simply share information with my students, and I'm just a little head in the corner, students get bored. And so I try to switch back and forth a bit. Hopefully that's being helpful for you folks. Here's the thing about rationality. Generally, when we're starting out in economics, we're going to start talking about people who are rational. And this is our first segue to start talking about how we can introduce race, ethnicity, and inclusion into our discussion. Because typically we'll find discussions of perfect competition, and we'll say, you know, what is going on here, that all firms are going to be profit maximizing, and that's going to be it, right? A firm that is not totally 100% dedicated to maximizing profits will be replaced or will be underbid, will be beat out by other firms. And non-satiation of preferences. So these are the mainstays of what we're teaching early on in our economics instruction, but not all instruction in perfect competition. We find that there are areas where race can be inserted quite naturally right here into those conversations. And that's what I would encourage for our instructors is here is the opportunity to start talking a bit about it as we're starting to build up these foundations. We introduce the students to some ideas that I have highlighted here about behavioral economics and experimental economics. To the extent that what we can see is that, hey, you know what, we set up these models where actors are perfectly rational, where everyone is only interested in maximizing utility. But when we go to the labs, when we see what's going on in behavioral economics, we see that that's not always the case. A perfect opportunity for us to have a discussion about where race fits into this and where we don't see it. In my own work, I've done some work centering around what could be called loosely envy. And so what I found is that economic agents respond differently to envy when they see, and I've done this with experiments, when economic agents, students, are given incentives and tasks to do. However, they see that their colleagues are engaging in those activities and being remunerated at different rates, the next thing that comes out of their mouths is that, hey, you know what, this isn't fair, right? This isn't fair. And that's the perfect opportunity, at least it's been in my experience, as another way to introduce in race, ethnicity, and exclusion discrimination. I say, well, is there any other times where you've encountered situations that you felt were unfair? That starts the discussion naturally. It isn't one that's forced upon the students. It's one that comes naturally. And that's where I go back to that first point about listening. At that point, when I let the students tell their stories, the stories themselves, I then become the student as they are the instructor, as they're saying, hey, you know what, economics needs to take this into account. They need to have this addressed. And I say, you know what, you're absolutely right in that regard. Natural fits in perfectly, not forced, allows student participation, all of the types of things that we want to have happen, where we want students to be naturally engaged, takes place when we start from the premise that not all of what we're going to be talking about is necessarily going to be fair. In that regard, there's some room now to start talking about the labor market. Let me share another page with you here. The labor market. So what we found is one of my colleagues, Trayvon Logan, who is a professor of economics at Ohio State University, has done some really interesting work. And I would encourage you all to look up Dr. Logan's work. He's done work on the ability of certain individuals to even get to the interview stage in the labor market when they have what's considered Black sounding names. That has nothing to do with their abilities at all. Once again, this is a perfect opportunity to introduce race as we talk about the labor markets, because generally in my classes, we're going to talk about the marginal product of labor, right? And we don't even discuss the fact that there might have been something going on before these workers ever made it, such as what we see in Dr. Logan's work. Some work that you can find at the American Economics Association has even shown that non-Black job applicants of equal ability receive 50% less, 50% more callbacks than Blacks. Perfect opportunity to introduce that into our labor market discussions. And the good thing about some of these works here is that they are accessible even to the high school level students. So for those of you who are high school level instructors and you say, well, look, an entire research paper written and published in an academic journal might be a bit too dense for some of my students. I can appreciate that. This type of work you'll actually find in the popular press. This is the type of work that when it's brought up, it's easily accessible, it gets the students engaged, and it is starts a conversation, which I think is the most important thing that we want to do. We want to start a conversation. Finally, another piece I have here shows that some research has shown that Black males without criminal records receive the same rate of callbacks for interviews as white males just released from prison when applying for employment in the low-wage job market. That work is out there too. I think if you simply do a simple Google search on using this topic right here, that work will pop up too. All of that is easy for us to do so that when we're talking about the labor market, that's a perfect opportunity to talk about inclusion, ethnicity, race, exclusion, fits in perfect, and it's an easy discussion. What I found from my colleagues is that people say, look, I don't want this to become difficult. And it doesn't have to. And it doesn't become difficult when, in fact, we make it natural, when it naturally fits in. Because to some extent, we find that some of our students have been brought up with ideas that run counter to what we find. That is also good. That is also necessary for the free exchange of ideas and discussion, for us to be able to talk about these areas and to talk about them in a way that engages everyone. Okay, so I'm just moving along here, trying to keep things going. Let me share with you one other area, well, many more areas, but let me go here, because this is my fun graph. I really like to show this graph in class. So one of the areas I like to talk about in my class, and this is open even to the high school students, because it's a simple chart, but it's a powerful chart. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at things that are going to separate people above and below the median income. And so what do we know? The median income in the United States is hovering around $53,000. I might be off a bit like that. And that's the line, this line that you see here, the gray one. And what do we know about the median? Easy idea to introduce to our students. Median simply separates the population into two halves, those above, those below. They don't need to know any statistics. It's a concept that once they get it, it's easily understood. And I'm saying, okay, let's look at who is above the median, who is below, by different categories. We're looking at education here, which I love to talk about. And then I move over to the type of household, age, which we know, and there it is. And there it is, race. There's never been a time when I've shown this graph that me and the class didn't have a full day's discussion, that this was it for the entire lecture. You know, I'm going along here and I'm talking about, hey, you know what, here are you folks, because I'm teaching here at the university. So all of you folks with bachelor's degrees, okay. And we're moving along, and then I hit this one. Naturally, it comes up in the discussion. And once we get here, we stop. We start talking about how this chart right here, easy chart for everyone to, you could have your entire lecture around this one alone. And I do, right? This one alone, I know on the day that I'm going to talk about income inequality and the things that are separating us above and below, this one always is one that is a winner. And as you can see, it's pretty simple, and there's not a whole lot to it, but it is powerful. This one gets that conversation going, and it naturally fits, right? I didn't have to make anything up here. This is where that naturally fits into the discussion. And that's my probably biggest takeaway that I want people to walk away with, that economics from its earliest introduction through PhD has very natural ways that we can fit this discussion of race and ethnicity into it. It doesn't have to be forced. It doesn't have to make anybody uncomfortable. It doesn't even have to really be controversial. It just doesn't, because it is what we do. And the students will have so many questions. Once they start down this path and asking these questions, they'll say, well, what about this? And what about that? right? So let me go back to my sharing mode with you again, because what I want to do is give you more resources. Here's an interesting one. So on the American Economics Association website, recently I did a interview on a piece of work that was done with myself, my co-author Amanda Bear, and my co-author Ebonya Washington. And Ebonya Washington is actually one of the participants in the panel discussion that's going to come later. We wrote a paper and I was interviewed about it. And what was the paper itself? It should be here. And this is free for any of you too, folks. So feel free to go and give it a click, right? How you can work to increase the presence and improve the experience of Black, Latinx, and Native American people in the economics profession. That's the key, right? In our profession, how can you, I wanted that to be all capitalized there, but they didn't do it. How can you work to increase this and improve this experience? And so if you and your students aren't interested in reading that, then come and just have them listen to the podcast. The only downside to this podcast is it's more of me, right? And by now, you're probably sick of hearing my voice. By this point, normally in my lecture, my students are like, okay, can this guy be any more monotone than he already is? I don't know what they want from me. I'm not going to sing, and I can't dance. So this is what you get. So here's a podcast, about 20 minutes long. Great for students, since students seem to like podcasts. They can have a listen to this. Another resource for you if you want to talk about some of this discussion. So not bad at all for you folks if I'm sharing resources with you. So that's the types of things I think that you want to do. You just want to look for ways that this discussion can be natural. And to that end, let me share with you something else that is free, a resource for everyone, and something that I think is pretty fun, right? So here's something else I will share with you, also from the American Economics Association website. By now, hopefully you're looking at SIMGET profiles. And what you have here is the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Econ Profession. And we have a series of profiles on minority economists. Here is Derek Hamilton, who was at Ohio State. Now I think he's back at the New School. But if you would like to introduce the work of minority economists, here is a great resource for you. Now, not all of these minority economists are doing work on race and ethnicity, but they are minority economists, and you can then say, hey, what we know is that sometimes minority students want to see role models. They want to see the end result. In fact, I've had many students say to me, I didn't know that I've never seen a Black economist. You know what? There's one right here. And here are a bunch of them. Let's click on them. Let's see what we get. Let's click on William Darity. Hey, there's one. And he does a lot of work on poverty. Let's look at his title, right? He is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, the chair of African and African American Studies, right? Wow. The Director of Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Just a great resource for you folks to access. In fact, easy thing to do. Easy for you to say, hey, you know what? You want to look for a role model, or you want to write a, well, back in my day, we used to call it like a book report. I think that's an antiquated term. But anyway, if you wanted to do a biography on any of these folks, just take a click and look up one. Let's see who we got, who we have. Let me see who we'll go with here. Who's there? Oh, Randy. Randy's pretty interesting. So Randy is a Native American. He's at UCLA. Great profile on Dr. Key out at UCLA. I really would encourage all of you to look through these sets of profiles, which are free and open and available for everyone to look at. You can even do one of me and my enormous melon head. There we go. So we won't spend any time on that one. All right, let me stop sharing that one with you. Role models. If you've got students of color in your classes, minority students, and they say, hey, you know, where can I go to find people who look like me? Are there people like me who do this type of work? And what about that address the types of questions that I might have? They're there. This is available to you. I would strongly encourage you to take advantage of these resources, because this is exactly why we have them available to you. Another thing I want to share with you, I'm going to go back to sharing again, back and forth, is podcasts. So I shared with you that one podcast, which came up, but there are more, right? And so you saw the one podcast, but here's an interesting share I'm going to do with you, and I'm going to highlight one of my colleagues here. Let me see if I stopped my share. I shouldn't have done that. I want to share with you this young economist right here, Todd Sorensen. So what did Todd do? Todd called me up one day and he said, would you be willing to do a small podcast on any of your work that you want? It could be about race and ethnicity and how it fits into economics, but it doesn't have to be. Of course, since most of my work revolves around race and ethnicity in economics, it was easy. And then what he did was he created a short podcast. We talked for maybe 10, 12 minutes, and he assigned it to all of his freshman level students. So that's a perfect opportunity for you. If you're wondering, how do you want to introduce this into your class? Do what Todd did. Do what Todd did and simply interview or have a conversation with or about, you know, economics as it relates to racial and ethnic inequality in our economy, right? Todd said to himself, I'm not an expert on this. I don't know, but being any good social scientist, he said, I don't know, but I can find the people that do know. That's exactly what he did. He reached out to me, and I was so impressed, especially since he was able to do it so quickly and didn't take up a lot of my time. I was happy to help him out. And so I would encourage you to think about these podcasts, because the students tend to like these podcasts. And I see that I'm coming up on my time limit. So I will share with you one other page, and then I will stop sharing pages with you. Is the page I want to share with you now is this one. Hopefully you're looking at a page that just today, earlier today, September 17th of 2020, The American Economics Association just announced 5 new initiatives for diversity and inclusion in the economics profession. We have the AEA Award for Outstanding Achievement in Diversity and Inclusion. That's open to everyone. We have seed grants for innovation in diversity and inclusion. This is for economics departments, probably not open to folks at the high school level. However, here's the one I wanted to highlight is this one right here, the Andrew Bremer Undergraduate Essay Prize. So if you are in contact with any undergraduates, they can enter. They don't have much time because I think, they have until the last Friday of September, that's like 2 weeks from now at 5 p.m. Eastern time, to write an essay. What is the essay about? It's going to say an essay on the economic well-being of Black Americans at 750 words. Why is it named after Andrew Bremer? It just has to be about the economic well-being of Black Americans, because Dr. Andrew Bremer joined the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in March 9, 1966. Of course, this being a Fed-sponsored event, it's never bad to plug the Federal Reserve System, becoming the first Black member in the board's history. He served until August 31st, 1974. During his tenure, Dr. Bremer became known as an expert on international monetary policy. In later years, he used his position on the Board of Governors to draw attention to the economic plight of Black Americans. So if you are an educator at a university, or you are a student, undergraduate student, why don't you, if you meet these criteria here, you can think about applying for this initiative, which is one of 5 that the American Economics Association just launched today. If that one isn't of interest, just take a look at the 5 initiatives. The thing I want to draw attention to is that none of this happens without effort, right? The effort on the part of educators. You as the educator, if you want to see our profession, economics, more diverse, more inclusive, along the lines of race and ethnicity, we have to make those efforts. And so what I try to do with my time is share with you ways and ideas that this might be helpful to you. I believe that I am done talking, and I am done 2 minutes before my assigned time.
Hoov, thank you very much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. Good evening, I'm Mary Suter. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel this evening. Thank you all for joining us after a full day of teaching. As Hoov mentioned, we know you're either on Zoom overload or some other form of overload from your day's work. As I mentioned, Hoov will be joining us on the panel. There was a lot of interest in your median income graph. Do you think you could provide that so we could share it with our webinar participants?
I will provide all of the stuff that you just saw, but everything else is at the AEA website, right? So when I went to all that stuff from the web, that particular graph, you can have, I'll give it to somebody and it'll be available to you.
Thank you. And we were sending out links as you were speaking to everyone for the AEA website. So they should have that. So thank you very much. Joining us on our panel this evening are Ebonya Washington and Dionissi Aliprantis. Ebonya, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little about your work?
Sure. As you said, my name is Ebonya Washington. I'm a professor of economics at Yale University, and I'm also the co-chair of the Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession. My work is on political economy of marginalized people. I'm very interested in how people use the political system to get economic needs met. For instance, I was interested in how the Voting Rights Act shifted resources from communities, shifted resources toward communities, Black communities. So that's the kind of work that I do. Dionissi?
Thank you. Thank you. Dionissi, would you take a couple minutes to tell us about you and your work?
Okay. Hi. Thanks, first of all, to the St. Louis Fed and Professor Hoover for that talk. I'm Dionissi Aliprantis. I'm a senior research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. And my research is really focused around neighborhood effects and segregation and trying to think about things like neighborhood dynamics. So for example, one of my papers tries to think about racial inequality in the United States a little bit from a perspective almost like North and South Korea or East and West Germany, and just try to imagine if, given the spatial inequality in the United States around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, if you could magically get rid of all discrimination, but the only kind of mechanisms you had were the spatial ones, you know, what would that lead to, and what kind of inequality could we expect? And I think what that shows you is thinking about how, I guess, kind of durable some of the effects from the past policies around racial inequality have been. So that's a lot of the work that I do. I also have been lucky at the Fed that I've been given time to work with middle and high school students. I've helped to implement several math programs here in Cleveland. And that's been a lot of fun. I think everyone, on this panel cares about teaching and enjoys teaching and working with kids, and that's a lot of fun. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Thank you, and thank you both for joining us this evening. Hoov talked a bit about this already, but I wanted to get your ideas about this, to have you weigh in on what you think about why it's important that we discuss race and inequality in economics classrooms. Ebonya, would you like to respond to that first?
Sure. Well, we need to discuss race because race is the force in what drives our society. And without it, the conversation would have this gaping hole that students would be aware of. Students are aware of things that are going on, and economics needs to be relevant to those things that the students observe going on. If we have a beginning economics class and there's no mention of race, there's no mention of racial inequality, income inequality, students are going to continue to think, which many of them already do, that economics is a profession that just doesn't have relevance, doesn't talk about real world issues. You know, when you're talking about something like sociology, it feels like from day one, you get to talk about real issues, about what's going on in society. And in economics, on day one, you're talking about widgets. So, you know, we need to be talking about race because it's relevant, because it's an important force in our society.
Yeah, thank you. That's so true. Thank you so much. Dionissi, would you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I would just echo Professor Washington's comments. I would say that I think you could think about it from several levels. So, you know, you could think about it in terms of self-improvement, and both as individuals and as a country that we need to improve. You could think about it in terms of something like justice, that you care about what kind of society you're in and how people in that society are treated. And I think also, we need to understand that, at least in my opinion, it's an existential threat to the United States.
Thank you. So there are a lot of questions coming in on the chat, I see, and some, and Gary Hoov talked a little bit about this, but I want to ask about why economics is well positioned for this discussion and where it fits. And as I said, I know Hoov talked about this a little bit, but are there specific topics or concepts or ideas that you think lend themselves more readily to discussion in economics about race and inequality, maybe beyond what Hoov shared? Dionissi, if you want to start with that one, and we'll.
Yeah, I'll start. I think the main thing I would say is that I think economics is really good at characterizing and quantifying trade-offs. And I think, to be honest, if we're going to solve a lot of the problems we have today, I think we're going to have to make some trade-offs. And I think, there's different kinds of conversations that are going on, and there's some conversations, I think we're going to have to pay to solve this problem. We're going to have to make some trade-offs. We're going to have to forego some other things. And, in a lot of ways, we'll be richer for it, but we need to address racial inequality in the United States, and we're going to have to make some trade-offs. And economics is really well positioned to help us think about those trade-offs, to think about quantifying them, and thinking about things like equilibria. And also, I was going to just say the idea of theory in economics, I think, is extremely important in the following sense, that we don't have infinite data. So we haven't observed the world in all these different states that we'd like to predict. And if we want to think about new policies or how things will play out, we have to have some kind of theory for making those predictions. And economics provides us that kind of theory, which I think is a very useful tool.
Can I jump in, even though I'm not
Sure.
a panelist?
No, please.
Look, I think one of the things that the main reason I would say that we need to address this is you cannot have an economy or society functioning with 13%, let's say that Blacks make up 13% of the US population sitting on the sidelines. It is bad for your economy. And what I think we need to address, and this is how it comes up in even areas of industrial organization beyond the ones I just talked about, is that we can't have 13% of our population sitting on the sidelines, sitting out, right, out of the labor market, out of being active consumers, and expect us to work at full strength. So in essence, the point I would add to what was just said is, what is good for minorities, racial minorities, is actually good for the entire economy, right? Because by making these people consumers, that just it makes it better for all of us. It's not a zero-sum game where to enhance these folks will have to be made worse off. No, it's not that we're trying to figure out how to divide up the pie. We're trying to make a bigger pie, and everyone can have a bigger slice. Mm-hmm. Just jumping in, sorry.
No, that's great, thank you. Ebonya, did you want to add something to that?
I think I already addressed that one. Well, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, because I think I already
the question was that why do you think economics is a good place for this discussion of race and inequality, and what economic concepts or topics do you think really lend themselves to bringing that discussion in? And so I know Hoov mentioned a few, but there might be some that you use in your classes that.
Right. So I don't know that economics as a profession is particularly well equipped to have this discussion. Mm-hmm. We haven't been having this discussion. I think we need to improve about having this discussion so that we can be relevant and that students have some interest in economics. As far as other topics, externalities is a great one. People talk about that sometimes without race. So they may be talking about the effects of, say, pollution. And in the example, there's some big company pollutant and there's some neighborhood or something like that. You can bring in the facts behind it. You can talk about which neighborhoods this is more likely to be happening to. So that's one example. I think there are really a ton of examples. I think that you bring in race when you bring in the real world. So often we're just talking about theory and our examples are stylized, but students are much more interested if we can map them to real things that are going on, to graphs like the one Hoov showed that gives the real inequality. Students are much more interested in that. And once you go to real life, there is race. If you use US data, there is race staring you right in the face.
I really appreciate the externalities example, and it made me think of East St. Louis and some of the things that went on there with chemical plants and meatpacking plants, and those communities suffered. So that was a terrific example. Thank you. So I think that you mentioned that the economics discipline or field isn't ready to really tackle this discussion, or maybe they are, but they haven't been tackling it up to this point. So what kind of advice would any of you have for a teacher who might be hesitant to engage in this discussion for fear of saying the wrong thing, or saying the right thing, but saying it in a way that might be taken in the wrong way? And this kind of relates to, we have econ teachers, AP econ teachers, the great majority of them are white. And so we want them to address this in the classroom and be successful in addressing this topic in the classroom. So
I would suggest using the tools presented, right? That's why I wanted to give everyone a bunch of resources. If you're hesitant, then use some of those resources, use that chart, go to the website, and and more so, you can let the students teach you. Let them listen, right? As the discussion goes. Now, of course, they're not going to be able to say, well, the supply curve is doing this and the demand curve is doing this, but they do realize where they live and the environment that they live in and how that contrasts to other environments that they see. So being willing to listen and open up the discussion beyond, as Ebonya said, beyond the widgets is a perfect way to enter this discussion, is to say, how does this differ from what your experiences are?
Thank you. Ebonya or Dionissi, did you want to add?
Yeah, I understand that it can be somewhat scary to discuss race. The teacher is going to have a relationship with the students that lasts more than one day, right? The scary thing is you go in with a group of people, you say something the wrong way, and maybe it's posted to the evening news or something like that. But with the students and the teacher, there's a relationship that goes on throughout the semester or throughout a year. And you can simply begin saying, we're going to, in this classroom, I'd like to be able to discuss things openly and honestly. Let's together make some ground rules. Let's together think about how we want this discussion to go and what will happen if you disagree with what somebody last said. And together as a class, figure out how you're going to talk about these issues, because we have to talk about these issues.
Okay, thank you. Dionissi, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I would just second what everyone else has said. And then I think I would just say also just remember to be genuine, be yourself, and be human, and try to make connections with your students, and not to let perfect be the enemy of the good, because I think at this point, the urgency in actually talking about these issues and trying to find some solutions is pretty clear. So it's good to have as many constructive conversations as we can.
Thank you. So one of the questions that came through the chat was related to how you deal specifically, and Gary, Hoov, I'm going to start with you on this, how you deal specifically with a student who might obviously or overtly demonstrate prejudice in the classroom. I'm guessing you've had that experience, and how you
Right, well-
handled that.
Well, that goes beyond just economics. That goes to being a faculty member or being a teacher in this building, in this profession, and in society. So, for instance, one time I had a young man who hadn't been coming to class, and I said to him, "Hey, you know what? You can't sit on this first row." And he says, "Oh no, I can sit on this first row. The professor said I could." And I'm like, the professor said you could sit on this row. And I'm like, and he says, yeah, I'm like, and who is the professor? He says, I don't know, tall, black guy. I don't know his name, but I've seen him around. And we were able to have a conversation about his professor. So that was it, right? After he realized what had happened, he felt the need to take himself to the back of the classroom and not sit on that front row where I would put out the materials that we were going to be using that day. So it's going to happen. I think the best way to do it is to directly confront it, which is what I do by asking pointed questions such as, do you have any idea who you're even talking to? Clearly not, because I am your professor, but okay. And from there, that was the end of that. So that's going to happen often. I think part of the reason why is that for most of my students, they're going to say that you are the first and only faculty member of color I've had during my entire college experience. That happens here.
Ebonya, I would think you might have some experience with this as well, both as a woman and as a Black woman.
Yeah, are we talking about students saying something to the professor, or?
Well, really responding to perhaps, for example, the median income example, and saying something that demonstrates real prejudice on their part.
Yeah, I might wait a beat and see how another student would like to respond to this.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if no one responds, then I would respond. And I like Hoov's approach of asking questions to help others see, if not the very students see, kind of where that student's argument falls apart.
That's a great example. Sort of a teaching tip for everybody is to pause and then see if the other students fill the gap, and then if not, the questioning is always a great strategy. So thank you for sharing that. So one concern I have about all of this is I don't want our discussion of race and inequality to become the February of economics. And by that, I mean February is Black History Month. So we pretty much only talk about Black history in February, and the rest of the year we pretend it didn't exist when it should be integrated. And so if we want to see this integrated, I don't want it to see it become the last chapter in the textbook that doesn't get covered, or only be talked about in one class in a college curriculum. What can we do as educators to try to ensure that we get this interwoven into the discussion of economics, that we include race and inequality throughout?
Well, that's what I tried to do before at the beginning of my formal discussion, was to say it fits naturally, and it fits naturally in a lot of areas, right? And so that if in a typical semester you're going to go through 14 chapters, and if you're in AP, I would imagine that you end up covering modules, topics more so than you would actual chapters. I would say that 90% of those modules could have some discussion. It doesn't have to be a full discussion. It doesn't have to dominate the topic at hand, but they fit in rather naturally, especially when we're talking about U.S. policy.
So a way for those of us who support teachers and provide professional development would be to begin to help them identify within those units of instruction, topics to cover,
Yep.
and
How they can be
perhaps
inserted
ideas about
naturally.
how to integrate it.
They fit so naturally in so many areas that all you have to do is identify those areas, slip in the context, and then keep on going. And it doesn't dominate the entire conversation because it's going to come up again and again and again. And it feels more natural as opposed to being set aside.
Thank you. Ebonya?
I'm putting a resource in the chat. It's the DVQ website, and it really speaks to exactly this, how to have a more diverse and inclusive teaching of economics. There are ideas for how to mold your curriculum, for things like what Hoov was talking about. There are in the podcast, there are short interviews done with people of all races, professors of all races, researchers of all races, I should say, talking about their work. And so this is just a wonderful resource if you're thinking, how can I fit in a discussion of race in a particular area?
Okay, thank you. And so that leads me to another question. We have the AEA website. We have this website. Are there other resources that we might share with teachers that you can think of that would be useful in this manner?
Hoov mentioned the article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. That journal is ungated, and so all issues are free. And it's written not in the professorial language of the other economics journals, but it's really in a more plain spoken, used a lot in undergraduate classrooms. And I would think then, therefore, it could also be used in the AP classroom. And, they discuss topics in ways that, students can get into, because they talk about, an overview of a topic, what are the pros and cons for whatever the issue. So that can also be a nice resource. I mean, as much as possible to bring in, I think, real research, and this is the way you can, but in a simplified fashion, and to bring into real policy. Someone is asking, what's the name of the journal again? The Journal of Economic Perspectives.
Which can be found from the AEA's website.
And I think I actually have that article on my computer, so we'll share it with the attendees in a PDF form, so they have it. So what impact do you expect that integrating economics into classes, economics and a discussion of inequality might have on those who consider to choose economics as a major? Do you expect that we can have an impact and bring more minorities in to the discipline?
Yes, and well, let me give you a story, right? It seems like that's all I got. I got a bunch of stories.
That's
so
good. They're more entertaining.
I had a student once who was actually a white student. He was an undergraduate. And he had taken my class, and this is when I was at the University of Alabama. And he came back to the university about 5 years after he had graduated, and I asked him what he was doing on campus, and he said he had gotten a job at a firm, and now he was back recruiting, and specifically, he was looking to recruit people of color for his firm. And I said, well, how did that come about? He said, well, he had grown up in Alabama his entire life, and that he had had very little actual interaction with African Americans, and specifically no one that would be in charge of him, but that he had taken my class. That interaction with him stuck with him so much that later on, when he left and joined the workforce and had an opportunity to look for people to hire, he made it his mission to go and look for people of color because of the nature of the interaction he had in the class, right? The class was more than, and I say all that to say, the class was more than just where does supply equal demand? And what is the term marginal? The class meant much more. And I think that's what introducing this topic effectively into the curriculum, whether it's AP, whether it's down, even at the elementary level through college, that's the impact we can have, that these introductions of race into the curriculum does more than you think. Because I had no idea that this student had been impacted that way. End of story.
Thank you. Ebonya or Dionissi, do you want to comment?
I completely agree that by changing the curriculum, we will change much more than that first semester experience. I do believe that we will get more people majoring in economics and perhaps going on further. It's too many students, I'm the director of undergraduate studies, too many students come and tell me in maybe their junior year, you know, I didn't know you could do X with economics. I didn't know about behavioral or health economics or political economy. And, you know, if they had known, they might have stuck with it. But the way economics is now, it just takes too long to get to the applied. You know, there's intro, micro, and macro, intermediate, micro, econometrics, and now you may choose an elective. So by bringing topics that interest students into the very first class, we can do a very nice advertisement for economics. Keep a lot of those students who end up going to, say, sociology or other social sciences, dismissing econ, thinking that we don't talk about these social issues. And in that way, change the profession little by little. But you know, some of those additional people who will major will go on to get PhDs, and there you go.
So Dionissi, did you want to talk a little bit about that? No? Okay.
No, I'll pass.
Okay, thank you. So something I wanted to mention related to that, as we talk to high school teachers here, is as you're like AP teachers, as you mentioned, Gary, are, you know, they're tied to this curriculum that they have to get through, and high school econ teachers also, but bringing in some examples at least of the type of work that economists do and using the materials on the AEA website to do that, and sharing at least some summaries of articles about topics of interest to students. And I would encourage you to, when you do that, show pictures of the authors. You may not be able to interview them or invite them to your classroom, but at a minimum, you can show pictures of who these people are so that they see that there are people who look like them who are doing this very important work that they weren't even aware economists do. So that's just kind of a side note from me. So that, because I think, as Ebonya pointed out, we have to generate their interest early, not when they're juniors in high school, juniors in college. So starting with some interest in high school would be a good positive thing. So I want to turn a little bit to today's environment, and I want to ask you, in what ways has the COVID-19 pandemic drawn attention to racial inequality, and what resulting factors are most concerning as we strive toward economic recovery? And Dionissi, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so one thing that I was going to bring up earlier, talking about teaching and introducing race in the classroom, is I think, you know, just looking at data sometimes can be really kind of eye-opening, whether that's, you know, looking at a map. So just look at the racial dot map online. Just look at how people are sort across cities. I think, you know, sometimes the way race is in our society, it just turns into, it's just in the air, or it's just, you know, it's part of the water we drink, and it just becomes so kind of normalized, sometimes some very ridiculous situations, that I think COVID is one of these things that makes it very clear just how unequal our society is. And in that sense, I think it's, you know, that's something that's good. What's very worrying for me personally is I think, going forward, I think it's very clear that, it is something that's going to have disparate impact on people. To me, it seems like it's only going to increase inequality.
Thank you. Hoov, did you want to
Yeah,
comment?
well, so one of the things that's going on is, as was Gigi mentioned in my introduction, I'm the editor of the Journal of Economics, Race, and Policy. And I have a special issue coming out in probably a month and a half, that is dedicated to specifically COVID and race and inequality. And most of, if not all of that material will be free, and it won't be behind the paywall, and anyone wanting access to it can have access to it. Everything from the health disparities by race caused by COVID-19 to educational disparities by race caused by COVID-19 to things really not really considered, right? What happens to eviction rates as a result of COVID-19. All of those things will come out in a special issue. And the journal is the Journal of Economics, Race, and Policy. The issue is not out yet, but it will be. And I would encourage all of you educators looking for material to take advantage of it, right? It's all about resources. All of this stuff is about resources, and I just want to provide resources for you.
And is that journal open to?
It is not, but what they have done is the journal is by Springer, and they've made all materials related to, they've got a portal for issues around racial inequality that they're opening up. And I was informed that they should be opening up the materials around COVID also.
That's great.
That's my understanding today. Of course, tomorrow, when everyone goes there, they'll say, no, we're not going to do it. But as of today, it's open.
Okay. Ebonya, did you want to add anything for that question?
I think you ended by saying what seemed the most scary or something like that about this situation.
What factors are most concerning? Yes, as we strive, to recover.
Maybe this is obvious with our audience, but education, right? The fact that young people who do not have good access to the internet or to a good computer are basically, in many places, going to lose this school year. And what will that mean going forward?
Yeah, I think that ties back to something Dionissi said earlier about us as a society needing to think about the trade-offs that need to be made, and perhaps reconsidering the need for dollars to go to education and to resources for students who have been demonstrated they don't have access to the resources they need to get their education in this current environment.
Right.
Dionissi, did you want to comment on that any further?
No, but thank you. But I will just say that, I think, as Ebonya said, I think, there's the issue of education right now, where just thinking about how unequal the kind of experiences of kids are going to be this year, or they already are in a lot of ways. It's also something that's very worrying to me.
Thank you. We're coming up on our last few minutes of the panel. Is there anything else any of you would like to share, specific examples or suggestions for educators to think about as they strive? And I think, we have a lot of educators who, especially economic educators, want to do a good job. They're on this webinar at this hour of the night after a full day of teaching because they are so dedicated to teaching economics. So if you have other suggestions and ideas you can share with them for making this happen and making this positive for them and their students, and anyone can start.
Well, I'll just go back to what I reiterated before. What I started with was that you make it easy, right? Make it seamless and make it fit in where it fits naturally in your curriculum. So although I named a bunch of different areas, maybe for you, you're not comfortable with all of them. So then just do one, right? But wherever it is, make it fit naturally as opposed to having it as a set aside. Whatever you can naturally address and fit in is where I would suggest that you operate from, because it would still be an improvement over nothing. And that's where we've been with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So your best efforts is all I can ever ask for. And I appreciate it.
Thanks, Hoov. Ebonya?
Yeah, I would add that if you're really worried about this and nervous about this, you can really do this. I mean, as Mary's just saying, you all are the folks who taught all day and came out in the evening to hear more about this. You clearly do your homework and then some. You know the material. You're existing in this society. You really, really can do this, and I believe in you. And like Hoov, I thank you.
Dionissi?
Yeah, I'll again echo what was just said, and I think one thing I would say to teachers maybe that might feel a little bit uncomfortable with discussing race in their classroom, I think making it natural is obviously one good way to go. And if you feel even uncomfortable with that, and I don't know how to do that, I think one way to approach it is view it as we're all educating ourselves. So I just finished reading a book at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. We have a book club where we're reading a book called The Color of Money, and there's a lot of details in that book that I've been studying racial inequality, trying to think hard about it, at least for, I don't know, maybe, more than 10 years. And there were a lot of details in there that I knew, but I didn't know super well. And I think we can always think about these as opportunities, these situations as opportunities for educating ourselves as well. And then that'll just, transfer to the students as well. So I would just say, as was mentioned earlier, make an effort towards it and it'll be moving in the right direction. So, don't worry too much about it.
Yeah, I think all of you have made a wonderful point there that, and I think it's related to just starting to eat the elephant one bite at a time, right? We can't do it. You're not going to be able to do everything immediately, but don't let that stop you from taking the initial step and doing the thing that is most comfortable for you. So if it's when you're teaching about median income and inequality, that you're able to discuss it there, or when you teach about externalities, if you're able to discuss it there, but to find that opportunity, as Gary pointed out, where you're comfortable, and as Dionissi said, just starting, and as Ebonya said, you are the best of the best. And we say that often about our economics teachers, because they really care and they want to make a difference in these kids' lives. So with that, I want to say thank you to our three panelists and for a great discussion and for sharing all the resources. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gigi.
Thank you so much, Mary. In closing, I'd like to extend thank you again, our sincere thanks to Hoov, Ebonya, and Dionissi for sharing your expertise and your insight on this really important topic. Also, thank you to Mary, my colleague, for guiding the discussion as a moderator this evening. Although the current school year will be very different from any other, we hope you've received information and tools that can be useful in any setting. We recognize that many aspects of your curriculum, instruction, and student interaction will be experimental and flexible with the changing climate. However, we are optimistic that this discussion, when shared with students, will spark more inclusive ideas and practices. Even though learning will occur in many varieties, whether that be in person, remote, or hybrid, illustrations heard tonight can help move towards real and sustainable change in the racial economic divide. Armed with these examples, each of us can strive to cultivate a more diverse and inclusive environment for our students, schools, and communities.